Well, I'm excited to give the last and final talk of Governance Week. I'm in the advantageous position of introducing myself, so I will reserve the first 20 minutes to extol you with my background. Now, I'm Andy Hall. I'm a professor at the Stanford GSB. I've been studying decentralized governance for a while now. I'm very privileged to get to work with the crypto research group here. I'm going to present to you some joint work with my co-author and my pre-doctoral research fellow, Sho Miyazaki, who's at the GSB with me. As the organizer of Governance Week, I feel I made a very foolish decision to schedule myself last. And Peter in particular is a tough act to follow, and I'm not nearly as erudite, nor is my accent as cool as Peter's, but I'm going to do my best to entertain you in this last and final presentation. Very big picture, the motivation behind this project and a lot of other stuff we're doing to study governance in Web3 is this observation. We have a lot of reasons, both practical and philosophical, that we think democratic governance is a good way to set things up, both in the physical world and in the digital world. And we've been using tools to do that were kind of developed a long time ago, when physical constraints were different than they are today. And so many people over many years have continuously asked this question, there's got to be better ways to do this now that we have access to so many new tools. And so that has been a long thinking idea, is that modern technology should let us improve the way that we run elections, that we use voting rules, and so forth. And yet it's actually been pretty elusive to figure out what the right ideas to pursue in this space are. And today I want to zoom in on one that I think is especially interesting. I'm going to tell you a little bit about why I think it's especially interesting, that is sometimes called liquid democracy, which is just a really cool, awesome name, so obviously we should be into it. The funny thing about liquid democracy, I'm going to tell you a little bit about how it works. I'll very briefly touch on the history of it, which is fascinating. I wish we could talk about more. And then I'll talk about why we're studying it. But so this is a popular idea. It's especially popular in tech spaces, though it actually has origins that go beyond tech. And what is the idea of liquid democracy? How is it different from representative democracy? There's at least, I think, 4 key attributes. The first is it's open. And what I mean by that is that anyone who's a voter is like a latent representative as well as a voter. I can give my vote to anyone else I want. I can say, Peter, I want you to be the representative. I'm not constrained to a list of candidates that some process has selected for me. So that's pretty interesting. It's continuous. I can change who I give my vote to whenever I want. So instead of having elections at some regular period, anytime I please, I can switch my vote to someone else. One idea that sometimes comes up in it but isn't always present is sort of similar to this idea. I can change it whenever I want. In some ways, this is almost mathematically equivalent. I can give my vote to different people for different types of decisions. So instead of having one representative who I'm asking to be a jack of all trades, I can give my vote to Peter when the decision is about ranked choice voting and whether we're going to implement it. I can give it to Tim when it's about designing the economics of the blockchain. And the final one, and this is actually important to the word liquid, but often actually not present in most interesting voting systems, is the person I give my vote to can then further give it to someone else. And that's the liquidness in some conceptualizations of this comes from the idea that then allows votes to flow to the people most expert in making the decision. So we put these things together, and we have this kind of fascinating, really radically different looking voting system than a normal set of elections for representatives, right? So you can imagine that it's this very open, smooth system where lots of people are giving their votes over to other people with the hopes that they're then aggregating into the best set of people, whoever they may be, holding the most voting power. That's kind of the idea. Well, let me say one last thing on this. The idea for this actually predates modern technology. It's debatable who really came up with it first, but in some sense, Lewis Carroll, author of Alice in Wonderland, is credited with the first concrete, fleshed out proposal for something that looks like liquid democracy. Surprisingly, he did not come up with as cool a name for it as liquid democracy, despite his creativity, but the idea really goes back a long way. And then Gordon Tullock, very famous public choice academic in the mid-20th century, was one of the first people to take this idea and to say, now that we have modern technology, his ideas it was mostly premised on television and phone calls, observed that we're getting closer to being able to implement something like this. And so Tullock proposed a version where you still elect representatives, but all the deliberations of Congress are broadcast on television, and at any moment you want, you as a voter could override the vote of your representative, and you could reallocate your vote continuously as things are being voted on. Then in modern day, it's really come alive with digital technology and the idea that now we can really implement quite directly this idea that we could all transfer our votes to whoever we want as we're voting. And so it's actually a quite old idea, but it's gotten a lot of energy as technology has progressed. Broadly, so why did we pick liquid democracy? I hope I've made the case that it's very cool. And the question that, this age-old question that we should figure out how to improve democracy in a very broad sense is reason enough to study something like this. But it actually turns out to be a very direct practical importance today in Web3, in other parts of tech, and in finance. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about that to explain why I think this is such a great topic for more research. So first of all, in Web3, the majority of the most important, and important maybe is not the right word, but like largest DAOs, they generally use something, either the Governor Bravo contract, which we discussed earlier this week, or something similar to it. And that smart contract implements something that looks a lot like liquid democracy. In particular, it implements the ability for you to delegate your vote to anyone else. They don't have to be an official candidate or anything like that. You can delegate to them. I'll just note, and this will come up again later, there's no redelegation. So I'm a little bit abusing the term liquid democracy by calling what's going on in Web3 exactly liquid democracy, but it's very close, and I think a lot of to me at least, the most interesting parts of the system are the ability to delegate to anyone else. The redelegations, in practice, I think it's quite unlikely we would ever see lots of that, but maybe I'm wrong. So it's already today active in important DAOs in Web3, so we should want to know how it works, how we could make it work better. From its use in Web3, we can learn about its applicability to lots of other domains as well. And so I just want to note two areas that I think are ripe with opportunity here. One is the rapidly accelerating world of what I would call AI governance, where all the major AI companies, including Meta, where I've done work on this topic, are developing different systems for the governance of these new technologies. And in particular, they're very concerned about setting guardrails around AI. Just to pick one example, I'm not at all picking on this company because every company has faced this problem, but when Google released Gemini, there was this huge backlash based on sort of guardrails that had been put around how Gemini worked that seemed to reflect some people's values in societies and not others. People got very upset. It had to be pulled back. There is, out of many experiences that all AI companies have had like that, there is this constant thread of rhetoric of we need to find a democratic way to set the guardrails around AI. Today, most of that work is being done via sortition. So Anthropic, OpenAI, Meta have all used some kind of a citizens' assemblies approach, kind of like exactly what Bailey was talking about yesterday. To do that, in the future, as these things mature, I think it's very likely that they will implement systems of voting for those decisions. And I have already heard people working in that space asking me, what is liquid democracy? What is delegation? We've heard that's what we should be using. So I think that conversation is already out there. That'll be a very important application. And of course, Web3 AI will be a big part of that conversation as well. The final category, which might be the most surprising to you unless you're in the finance space, is very surprising to me, is that the very, very large asset manager companies are right now today implementing forms of delegated voting systems. So proxy voting has always been around to some extent in corporate shareholder voting. When I first heard about liquid democracy, I was like, great, these geniuses have reinvented proxy voting. But it turns out, proxy voting is quite crude and very, very limited in corporate shareholder voting. There isn't very much of it in practice. And today, BlackRock, Vanguard, and State Street, which together are by far the three largest holders of voting power in publicly traded companies in the US because of the ETFs that they hold, that they sell to customers. They are all in the process of developing what they call voting choice programs that pass through the voting power of their ETFs to their customers. And the idea is we, as these large asset holders, we shouldn't have an undue amount of power over the votes that are about companies that you, our customers, are really the underlying owners of. We would like you to vote instead of us. It's uncomfortable for us that we're the ones voting your shares. And so they are building these systems in which they're attempting to encourage their customers to vote more of their shares instead of BlackRock, Vanguard, State Street. And the manner in which they're doing this, I will tell you more about it later in the talk, is like a highly constrained version of liquid democracy. And it seems extremely likely to me that in the future, as they try to expand it and open it up, it is going to merge with what is going on in Web3 with liquid democracy. So for all three of these reasons, I think there's timely, practical reasons to want to study this, not only the super cool big picture question of can we redesign democracy around principles like this? So that's the motivation. There is already lots of research on liquid democracy. I'm not at all trying to claim we are doing the first research on liquid democracy, but I want to explain why the large literature that there is doesn't answer most, or perhaps all, of the practical considerations we need to know how to implement it well. And this will touch a little bit on a theme from Peter's talk. So that Peter did a great job, and one of the spirits of this visit this week, I think, is bringing together people studying governance across fields. And one thing we've observed, I think, in the history of all academia is that when you can compare insights and ways of thinking across field, you can discover new ways of conceptualizing things that help you make rapid progress on practical questions. Peter, I think, did a great job of showing why the social choice approach to the study of voting systems has been extremely useful. And from a computer science perspective, my impression is it turns out is a very fruitful way to plug algorithmic analysis into the study of voting. Turns out to miss some really important insights that require the use of game theory and strategy, possibly in a way similar, Tim, to the growth of the sort of EC type community in other parts of computer science, that there's this fruit to be borne by the combination of strategy and game theory with CS techniques. I think Peter did a really good job of showing why that's definitely true for the study of voting systems and is true for liquid democracy. So one thing we see going on with liquid democracy now is a move from a computer science literature that has been almost entirely social choice driven to a strategic literature like this Moores et al. Paper I'm citing here that asks, when voters are strategic, will you still get good properties from this system of delegation? What we want to contribute, I am not smart enough to do that kind of work. I am a humble empiricist. And it turns out that in the same way that bringing game theory into the study of liquid democracy is very, very fruitful, bringing data into it is very useful too, because it turns out that the practical considerations of implementing liquid democracy have a lot to do with how actual people will behave within this extremely weird alien system of voting, kind of like Peter alluded to with ranked choice voting. And so we have a very rich theoretical literature on liquid democracy. There's already others in economics, in the social sciences, starting to apply game theory tools to a particular set of questions about whether liquid democracy successfully gets people to allocate their votes to the right, to the people who have more information, in theory. But we have almost no empirical work asking, in practice, does any of that have anything to do with how people really behave inside these systems? There is one fantastic paper. It is, as far as I know, the only systematic empirical study of liquid democracy. It's this Kling et al. Paper, and it is about the Pirate Party in Germany, which implemented a form of liquid democracy through a bespoke online platform. It's very cool, to make internal decisions. And so that paper is really focused, building from this theoretical literature, is very focused on this question of, is there over-delegation within these systems? Which would be a sign that we're perhaps not aggregating information effectively, we're overly centralizing because we're all giving our votes to Eliza or Robert or something. And then we only have one voter and that would be bad. And that is an important practical consideration. But there's only so much progress you can make studying, one question in one empirical setting. There is no existing work that looks across a set of cases of using liquid democracy, and there's none that have ever looked at it in a place where the decisions are high stakes. With no offense intended to the Pirate Party in Germany, but the internal decisions of that party have not generally been super high stakes in the way we would think about a political system making decisions in general. So what we want to do in this paper is really get to those practical questions about liquid democracy, and I want to lay out 4 practical questions about how liquid democracy works in practice that have not yet been answered. So the very first is the most basic. Peter alluded to this participation problem. If you make it possible to delegate to someone else, does anyone pay attention, notice that that's a possibility, and do it? That's a very basic question. Not surprisingly, to be tractable and useful, theoretical models tend to make optimistic assumptions about that, just to figure out, like, if this thing works, if we make optimistic assumptions, can we establish the possibility that liquid democracy is going to aggregate information in favorable ways and so forth? In practice, though, there's a very basic question of, does this work at all? Does anyone push the buttons to delegate their vote? So that's the very first thing we're going to show you evidence on. We're going to show you kind of like who's actually who's doing this, how many people are doing it. And that, I would just say, by the way, is just a theme of Web3 and technology governance in general, is we can create these extremely baroque, really cool engineered systems for governance. They often crash against the rocks of the reality that participation is so low. I'm going to show you some, in this case, I'm actually quite optimistic that that's not the case. Okay, then if you have people participating and delegating, which ones are the ones that differentially select into doing this? Not everyone is going to pay attention and delegate their vote. Who are the ones that do? Who are the ones that don't? If they decide to delegate, how do they make the decision of who to delegate to? Are they choosing carefully? Are they choosing wisely or not? And then finally, and maybe most importantly, if you think about these practical considerations, if you think about a Web3 AI platform setting guardrails through this system, or you think about BlackRock one day implementing it for shareholder voting, how do you actually build a system around these voting rules that gets people to pay attention, lets them figure out who their options are, creates the conditions for campaigns where you can understand the debates and decide, like, yes, that's who I want to delegate my vote to. That's all external to theoretical models of liquid democracy, but the first thing a practitioner would want to know if they're actually building a liquid democracy system. So I'm going to talk quite a bit about that 4th question. Our progress on this question is extremely simple to explain. We just went and got data for the first time from a set of high-stakes settings where liquid democracy or something like it is being used in practice. Our contribution is that simple. Turned out to be way harder. As a humble political scientist, pulling data from the blockchain was not as straightforward as I've been led to believe, but we did figure it out. And we just have this data that no one has had before, and that's in a nutshell, what we've done. There's just this incredible laboratory of these DAOs that are making very high-stakes decisions using this technology. So for anyone in the whole world across any of these settings interested in it, this is where I think they should look first. So what we're going to do is we're going to zoom in. We're going to make a couple of decisions to kind of very much zoom in. We're going to look only at Ethereum-based DAOs. That was just where we had the most knowledge and we're most comfortable. And we're going to look only at on-chain voting, which is going to massively restrict our scope. We could easily broaden this to include all the voting that goes on Snapshot, much of which also has a liquid democracy component. But we really wanted to zoom in on the high stakes, the self-executing, irreversible decisions that kind of like are the lifeblood of DAO governance. And just as a reminder, I think this is a kind of repetition for our visitors, but just to make sure you're clear on the setting, right? These are settings where there are governance tokens. They can be sold and traded, and it is one token, one vote. And so when I'm talking about delegating, I am talking about you taking your wallet, which has these governance tokens in it, and delegating them to someone else. Technically, within the Governor Bravo system, by the way, you have to delegate all the tokens in your wallet. Of course, you could always split your wallets and only delegate from one, but that's just something to note. And just like in the theoretical laying out of liquid democracy I told you before, it is indeed open. Any address can delegate to any other address, and it is open in that sense. And as I mentioned, the important thing we think really matters is the stakes of these votes can be quite high. I will note one more time, just in case, I always say this because there's some real liquid democracy purists out there. I'm not sure there's any in the room today, but this is not, there's no redelegation allowed. The Governor Bravo smart contract does not allow for redelegation.
Can I undelegate at any moment?
Yes, yes. People have debated, there's so many interesting design choices to make here, and one is you could try to lock delegations at some point. There have been some high profile moments in which people have undelegated at key instances.
I assume that the answer is no to both, but there's like two notions of redelegation. There's the person I've delegated to redelegating, or like me delegating twice in the case that somebody abstains.
Oh, delegating twice. So you mean I delegate to you, you abstain, and then I move my delegation?
No, I say like I delegate to Andy, but if Andy doesn't vote, then delegate to someone else if Andy doesn't show up.
I see. Yeah. So that's not implemented in Governor Bravo, at least?
I assume neither is implemented.
That's right. I will say, and I'm going to come back to this, the participation rates of delegates are lower than I would expect in our data. And so I think this issue of abstention is quite important. The participation of delegates tends to be higher than the average token holder, but it's nowhere near 100%. And I'll show you data on that. What I really want to emphasize, so that's like, I think the first contribution of a project that we're very excited about is like, we just got this data and we're going to tell you facts about how liquid democracy actually works in practice and suggest to you that it looks a lot different from the theoretical debates over it. But the second thing, which I think, at least from a social science perspective and maybe also from a practical perspective, might be the more important part of this, is these DAOs that we're going to study have intervened over time. And they've each built, not each of them, a set of them have built these online platforms to do the work I was talking about of creating this social and tooling environment around liquid democracy to make it actually work. And so they have built out, and I'm going to show you what one of them looks like, these websites that facilitate getting you to delegate. And I just want to pause for a moment and make it clear to you why that's so important. These theoretical models, which again, I find very valuable, I'm not trying to pick on them, don't get to any of these practical things. So they just say like, if this all works, if everyone knows everyone else and you want to delegate, here's how it would aggregate, which is something we need to know to understand if this idea makes any sense. Once we've done that though, we then have to step back and say, how would this actually work for a real governance system? And the first thing you'll be confronted with is, it's really not that useful as a governance system. If I have the option to delegate to a bunch of addresses out there, and I don't know anything about them. I don't know who they are. They haven't told me anything about their positions. They're just addresses floating in space. That's not a governance system. That's just silly. And so, of course, this was bootstrapped through people participating in the forums and posting on X and so forth. But most of the big DAOs over time were like, we need to build some kind of hub that will get everyone to coordinate, get people to sign up to be delegates, get them to say a little bit about why they want to be a delegate, what they would do if they win your vote, your tokens, and then make it point and click accessible for the voter to delegate to the person they like. And every DAO has done this in a different way, but I just want to point out, if we step back about these practical opportunities to build out systems of delegation and liquid democracy in other places, it is of incredibly high value, I think, that we have a set of DAOs where each of them built their own version of this hub, they've shared some technology, but built a version of this sort of hub or delegate program, as we're going to call it, at different times. And that's going to allow us to kind of exploit, I would call it, in the social sciences, we call this a natural experiment, where we're going to attempt to get some actual causal evidence. Here's how voting within a liquid democracy system changes when you go from it being this state of nature, to some extent, to this coordinated activity that has a website and all of these other bells and whistles. And so we're very, very excited that the way Web3 works has facilitated for us this natural experiment as each DAO has tinkered with the creation of its own version of liquid democracy at different times. I mean, I think we take these two things together and we think, wow, we have this this is a very novel opportunity to understand what's going on with liquid democracy in the wild, as we call it. Okay, in case I run out of time, let me tell you what we find right now so that everyone knows. First, I'm just going to tell you what are the overall rates at which token holders are delegating their tokens. Those rates To some people, I think they look low. We're talking like 20% of tokens in circulation or something. It's actually pretty comparable to corporate shareholder voting. Depending on your goals for voting, you could call that a high or low number. It's higher than I expected. My experience has been, getting participation in these systems is very hard. 20% was higher than I expected. What I think is particularly interesting when we ask this question of who's doing the delegating, to the extent we can tell, and the Sybil thing here is a huge impediment to making strong statements, it looks bottoms up. That is, it is smaller token holders delegating to experts more than we're observing large token holders delegating to someone else. That was also quite surprising to me. Could be large token holders chopping up their wallets, but I'm not sure they have other strong incentives to do that. I don't think they care. I don't think they were anticipating me drawing this histogram, but we just don't know. We can't tell you a lot that's like, yes, the voters are super ultra informed and they're choosing the delegates that match their reasoned views and so forth. We just don't know. But I'll tell you a basic fact that I do think is encouraging, which is delegates who have an established track record of voting more often. As I said, the delegates participation is itself a challenge. Those who have a track record of participating more often have received more delegations from more addresses. So it suggests at least this basic thing that somehow the system is helping voters to figure out, like, there are delegates who I can delegate to and they'll kind of do more, and there's some who'll do less, and the ones who do more are getting more delegations, which seems good. And then last, and this is, I think, the most interesting part, when the DAOs build these programs, these systems around liquid democracy to help people, we see, first of all, they're quite effective at getting rates of delegation to go up. So you get a bunch of people delegating who weren't before, and that actually then induces higher rates of overall turnout in terms of voting. And I'll explain to you when we get there why it's actually not obvious that that would be the case. And so it seems pretty encouraging that you build these programs and you're getting more people delegating and more people voting. And I think if we look again back to all these different other possible applications of delegation voting, that lesson is going to, I think, be quite important, that you can build these programs that probably will learn ways to build them better and better over time, and they're doing their job. They're getting people using these systems. So very quickly, we're just going to pull all the wallet level data on the on-chain votes in all Ethereum-based DAOs. The data I'm going to tell you about today goes roughly 2021 to 2023. A challenge with studies in this space is that new data is coming in every day, which is great for the world, but annoying for researchers trying to write papers. Dan Bonet has a vision where all papers should just be dashboards that update live every day, which I love. Maybe ChatGPT could rewrite the findings as the findings change. But we're going to take this snapshot in time and tell you about this time period. We are going to then bring in data on tokens in circulation. That's going to be our denominator. You could use other denominators. We think that's the right one to use to analyze governance participation. So it's kind of like, here's the set of tokens that could have been voted, could have been delegated. Here's how many were delegated, were voted. And then because of these restrictions we put on, because it's only the on-chain voting, because it's only Ethereum-based DAOs, and for a couple other reasons, we're going to end up with 18 DAOs. Of course, we would love to have more, but that's a decent amount. Covers roughly 1,700 proposals that were voted on from roughly 250,000 voters. So it's a pretty good chunk of information that we're working from. Let me just zoom through a couple of the basic facts, because I want to make sure to get to the effect of these websites before I finish. So this is sort of just to give you a sense of the proper nouns, not pun intended for nouns, DAO fans, of the names of the DAOs in our sample. So this is just a descriptive plot. On the x-axis here we have, of all the tokens in circulation, what proportion have been delegated to someone other than yourself. Note there's this little thing where you have to delegate to yourself to vote in Governor Bravo, so ignore that. We're not counting that. You have to delegate to someone else. And on the vertical axis is the proportion of tokens in circulation voted. And this is on average across all proposals. And you can see, there's a positive correlation. It's noisy. And you can just see that different DAOs are very different from one another. Some DAOs have quite a lot of delegation. Some DAOs have very little. Some DAOs have higher turnout, though never, extremely high turnout. And some have very, very low turnout. But this is just to give you a sense that this is the universe. If you look at the names here, like we have a lot of the DAOs you might think of when you think of DAO governance are in our sample.
If you plotted that for like concentration of token holdings in non-liquid, systems, would it look sort of the same?
Tell me what you mean by that.
Like concentration and participation. So like levels of delegation could also correspond to something like a level of concentration in the eventual vote, or a level of like, how many tokens were in effect being like actively voted or something like this. Is there in a world with like a plurality voting scheme where you can't delegate, is there some analog of like this chart we could imagine thinking about to figure out whether it looks the same?
I'm not sure I'm following. Geez, when you say concentration, do you want to like measure the heaping in voting, or you're just saying like?
Oh, sorry. Well, sorry, you're right. This is total level of delegation, not like the resultant concentration. So that's not the analog. I'm trying to figure out, like, I don't have a prior on what this picture should look like. So I'm trying to figure out what it should look like, what it would look like in some other voting scheme that didn't have this property.
Yeah. Let me show you some other pictures and let's revisit the real. This is just a figure to put some proper nouns in space. But yeah, I'm going to show you some evidence on concentration in a moment, and then maybe that's the right thing to think about for the analog. So here what I'm showing you is the average as a proportion of all tokens in circulation across all these DAOs, the average rate of delegation, so how many tokens divided by total in circulation have been delegated, and how many have been voted. That's the purple line that's lower. And the 2 points I just want to make here are the rate of delegation, you could call it high or low. It's around 20% of all tokens in circulation. And the rate of turnout is actually lower than that. And this is just one thing that you can sort of infer from this plot, is that not all delegates are voting all the time, right? If all delegates were voting over the time, then the turnout rate would have to be at least as high as the delegation rate, and that's not the case. There's some time trends over here which we could explore, but I'm not going to talk about that right now. This, Scott, is getting towards the concentration question. A big motivating question in the study of liquid democracy to date has been, okay, we want to aggregate information. There's generally not a notion of ideological competition in liquid democracy, which I think is a missing part that we need to study more. There's just this question of like, how do we aggregate to make the best decision in the sort of like Condorcet tradition? And lumpiness of delegations become a concern there. If a few delegates get tons of voting power delegated to them because they're the most popular, the smartest or whatever, even if they have the best signal of the correct choice, you've lost so many other signals by having everyone give their vote to this one person that it might be bad for the system. What I'm showing you here is two overlapping histograms. The underlying dark purple one is the underlying share in terms of tokens. So it's, again, as a percent of circulating tokens, what percent does a given address have? Modulo Sybil issues here, as usual. And in light blue is what that looks like after delegation. So when you think about delegates now, how many tokens do they hold for voting purposes? They don't actually hold the tokens. What you can see is there is this much longer tail, right? Where these are there's way more delegates with higher shares than there are underlying token holders. So indeed there is heaping going on here, but it actually looks quite a lot smoother than what has been documented in the Pirate Party. Now, this histogram is truncated, and there are a few cases I'm not showing you of delegates who have obtained quite large shares of the vote, and that's something we would definitely want to keep an eye on in the future.
Got it. Yeah, you're right. That's the analog, and I guess the ownership structure is somewhat endogenous to the choice of voting scheme, but that's pretty heartening, right? Like it would be hard to imagine that a system that doesn't allow delegation would have a figure that looks like dramatically better than that somehow.
Yeah, that's interesting. Okay, this is the other basic fact I wanted to tell you, which is that token holders on average tend to delegate to delegates who are voting more often. And so this is just, each point here is a binned average of many underlying points, and this is just a correlation. It's just showing on the x-axis for each delegate, here is how, as a fraction of all tokens in circulation, how many tokens they got delegated to them from other people, and on the vertical axis, their rate of voting. And what I want to emphasize here is like delegates' rates of voting are not that high. And there could be many reasons for that. But it is the case that the ones higher up here who in general vote more are getting more delegations. So something is causing these two things to correlate. It is not necessarily a highly informed process in which I, as a token holder, am like, I want to delegate to the person with the highest turnout rate, and I go check. There's many other possible explanations for this, but that's sort of a basic pattern that we observe.
Have you looked at this? Like you could look within delegate over time. As I get delegated more, does my voting rate go up?
Oh yeah,
as
no, we haven't
opposed
looked
to just
at that.
the cross-sectional correlation.
Yeah, and we haven't looked. There's also things we could probably do with like after the website is rolled out and stuff like that. No, we haven't looked at that. Yeah.
Do you also look at variation in these websites with how the delegates are displayed? Because I know one development with like Agora on Optimism and UnisSwap is going from kind of displaying based on token power or most delegates to weighted random.
This is such a good point. I'm going to hold that for a moment and come back to it. We haven't looked at it, but I agree it's like exactly the kind of thing that needs to be studied next. Let me zoom forward in the interest of time. I'm not even going to explain this ugly looking graph. I'm just going to say this is where we're showing you the best evidence we can, modulo the Sybil problem, that there's something bottoms up going on here. This really surprised me. This is basically showing it's medium to small wallets that are delegating at the highest rates. The larger wallets are actually generally preferring not to delegate. Yeah.
Is this sort of wallets just, or is this also smart contracts that you're looking at?
This is just wallets. Can you explain? You're probably getting at something important that I need to learn about. Like, what would you want to see about a smart contract?
Oh no, I guess it's better if it's just wallets.
Okay.
But like if like UnisSwap, for instance, a UnisSwap pool was in there that held quite a bit of a voting token, and that could be like an address with a larger share of tokens, which wouldn't delegate because it can't.
Okay, that's a really good point. We should. I'm pretty sure that's not in here, but that's a great point. We should definitely make sure it's not. Okay, let me zoom through here. Okay, so this is the part I wanted to make sure to get to. As I said, in the real world, building a voting system delegation and making it work is going to require doing a bunch of stuff that the theories understandably don't countenance. And what we're going to do is take advantage of the fact that different DAOs rolled out what we're calling these programs at different times. They also did it in different ways. I'm not today going to exploit any of that information to learn more, but that's definitely where we're heading, is like, can we learn from the fact that Uniswap's version was rolled out is different from Optimism's and so forth. But typically the way these programs look is there's a website that shows you all these delegates you could delegate to. It has a convenient point and click button, so if your wallet is linked, you can just point and click delegate. You can learn about the delegates. Sometimes there's a quote unquote whitelist where some committee or someone blesses some people as being like verified delegates and so forth. You can see how there's a lot of like options for how you could do it. This is kind of a prototypical example I'm pulling here. This is Uniswap. This one is built by Agora, which is like a service provider for voting in general, and Agora is one of the more popular interfaces for doing this. And the way it works here, I just want to give you a sense, and I want to suggest to you kind of like why this is interesting, but also why there's definitely scope to do more in the future. It's basically just a set of tiles showing you all the different addresses you could choose to delegate to. And what Eliza was getting at earlier, which I think is super important, is there's many options. And so a challenge here, this is like old school, platform design user issue here. We're gonna have to figure out some way to like display this information to you. And this has been a challenge for these programs so far. So it's very, very valuable that they're putting all these options in one place and making it easy for you to delegate. But when there are many potential delegates, how you order them potentially matters quite a lot. And so you can see here, and this has changed over time. They've been kind of tweaking this over time, which is, I think, makes sense. You can filter it. So here it's showing all stakeholders who've, on all issues. And right now it's weighted random, which I think means they take how many tokens the delegate has, and then they sample how they order them so that your probability of being ordered high is higher if you as the delegate have more tokens. Others have done this. I think Optimism at one point was doing just pure random. Uniswap used to just sort by size. And you can see how the way you do, if there's a lot of slack in the system and users are going to default to top ranked choices, if we've learned anything from Web 2, the suggestion would be there's going to be massive effects of these defaults. you can see how you might want to think really carefully about the different things that would incentivize. We don't have a lot to say about that today. I just want to emphasize that that seems like a very important research point for the future. If you sort it by size, you're kind of like, you're encouraging a snowball effect where the large delegates keep getting larger, which could be very good if you think it's kind of a reputation system where getting large is a sign that you're a good, serious delegate and you want to keep that going. But you can also see how that would be a deterrence to new people wanting to become delegates and would definitely potentially exacerbate this risk of over-delegation, overheaping in a small number of delegates and so forth. So it's tricky how to think about how to do this. I'll just note, again, there's a very optimistic thing going on in the background of these where the hope is that you click on these things and every delegate has a statement and has posted a video and you know all about. The reality is you click through and many, not just on UnisSwap, on all of them, and many of the delegates haven't even issued a position on anything, or they have a one-sentence position that's like, I'm going to vote to do whatever's like best for the DAO or something, which hopefully is not an informative platform. In equilibrium. But that's kind of where we're at. And so I think it's a fascinating space where we're just starting to build these things out. We want to know what has their effect been so far, and then we want to know, obviously, what could we do to improve them in the future. So I'm just going to show you quickly, since I'm almost out of time, these two basic questions, which are, have these increased rates of delegation to other people, and have they then increased turnout? And I just want to highlight, like, those are worth asking, right? Delegation's only going to increase if it's actually right that these frictions in the state of nature before these websites are big. And we don't know. Like, maybe these token holders are so into tech that they don't mind that in the past they had to, like, I don't know, delegate through the terminal or whatever you engineers do. Maybe they don't need the point and click system. Maybe they don't need the information. They're already super aware. So the first question is just, what is the margin? What's the size of this margin of like making it easier? Does it matter? But then the more subtle question is this one about turnout. Because if you make it easier to delegate and you get more people to delegate, there's at least two things that could happen. One thing that could happen is, I care so little about all this. I'm some token holder out over here in space. I'm not paying attention to any of this. I'm not voting, and I don't care if you build a website to delegate. I'm not delegating either. And the people availing themselves of this new website are like the enthusiasts who are already voting. And now they're like, oh, this is cool, I can delegate now. So the net effect on turnout will be nothing, because you're taking a person who's already voting and getting them to delegate. On the other hand, if the story is more like in the history of democracy, that there's a bunch of people who won't go to the trouble of regularly voting on every decision, but will go to the trouble to delegate their vote once to someone else, then this could have big effects on turnout. And so we need to know which of those worlds we're kind of in, and the data can help us answer that. So I don't have a lot of time. I usually like to give a whole overview to the CS people of how we try to extract causality from observational data. It's very cool. One of our proudest achievements in the social sciences. No offense to the theorists in the room. But basically, we're going to take advantage of this fact that different DAOs implemented this at different times, right? And so I'll just to wrap up, just as I'm ending here, like the point is, if we just compared DAOs who have these programs to ones who don't, and we said, hey, look, the turnout rates are higher in the ones that built these websites. That's the kind of thing someone might do. And that would not be good evidence that these programs are actually the thing that caused delegation rates and turnout to go up. Because guess which DAOs have the money and the time and the interest to build these? It's the ones that are already more important, more resourced, already have more people involved, already have higher rates of turnout. So we need to do something to get from that correlation to that causation. We're going to use what's called a difference in differences design, where we compare changes for the DAOs that used to not have these websites and now have them, to changes from a control group of DAOs that didn't implement them over this time period. And just in a nutshell, without going through this, so I don't keep you too long, we're going to find very large effects. The creation of these websites increases rates of delegating by about, let's call it 4 or 5 percentage points. And so if your mean of delegations around 20%, proportionally, this is a very, quite large increase. And maybe surprisingly, it causes quite a large increase in turnout as well. So the creation of these programs apparently is drawing in token holders who weren't all already voting, but who in fact are attracted to this new system, choose to delegate when they wouldn't have voted otherwise. And so it's kind of I think it's a sort of an interesting discovery that indeed making a system of indirect democracy easier to use is going to increase the amount of tokens flowing through the system to voting. Okay, so let me conclude with some practical implications of these findings for Web3 and beyond. So we know that a major obstacle in all voting systems and liquid democracy, right, is the willingness of voters to participate. We have some signals here that participation in the system is somewhat broad, but it's lower than we probably would like it to be. We have some evidence too that the delegation of these systems is a little bit bottoms up, which again I think is what we would like to see, but we might want it to be more. And we see that voters are at least somehow finding their way on average to the delegates who participate at higher rates. So these all seem like building blocks of a system we could make work, potentially. There's tons of other questions we need to ask. And then finally, we see that, okay, if you build these programs, you can get quite a lot more people to participate. But, and I think this is a big fact we take away from this, in addition to figuring out how to improve these programs down the line, and we have some thoughts about how to do that, we should be getting these delegates voting more. It's weird that we're only getting the delegates in these systems to vote 30, 40, 50% of the time. If we're going to delegate to you, ideally you're voting all the time. We would expect a legislator to vote essentially all the time. And so maybe that's a problem that we're asking too much of these delegates. Maybe they need to get paid more. There's a lot of questions about how to do this, but getting delegate participation up seems like the low-hanging fruit now that we've built these systems. And so I will leave it there and happy to talk more afterwards. Thank you.